Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Combat Concepts. Today, we'll be doing a deep dive into fundamental footwork for combat sports, specifically comparing rapier versus armored fighting. So put your gorgets on, harness up, and let's go. So, the big question is, why is footwork important? And simply put, we cannot effectively move and use our upper body, our core, our head, our arms, wielding weapons, and using implements without a solid foundation. And our legs and hips are, from the ground up, our source of balance and power. Today we're looking at heavy fighting versus rapier footwork. This is going to be a comprehensive fundamental footwork guide. Let's begin with defining some terminology. In regards to footwork, in this video, we'll use length, like long versus short, as a way to discuss the linear distance from your front foot to your back foot. This can be best observed from the profile view. This is a shorter fighting stance versus a relatively longer stance. Next, we'll use wide and narrow, which refers to the lateral distance between your feet. This can be best observed from the front or from behind, and you can see this is a wider fighting stance versus a more narrow stance. You'll notice that in these demonstrations, my back foot is using what I would describe as an active toe. In comparison, here's a stance where my back foot is flat on the ground and I'm not using active toes. You can see that active toes can be done with your feet parallel to each other, as well as with a bit of a turn out. Next, let's look at square hips versus open hips. Squaring my hips to my opponent means you will have both points of my hips point forward, whereas fully open hips will be 90 degrees compared to the direction you're facing. This is very much a gradient during fencing and will largely be determined by whether or not you have an offhand implement and how much you want that offhand to be in the fight in a particular moment. The most profiled version are modern fencers. Comparatively, in the SCA, we're often using multiple implements, sword dagger, sword buckler, and you'll see that we square up a lot more to allow your offhand to be part of the fight. With some terms defined, we're now going to dive into many of the common pieces of individual footwork. Let's start with a linear advance step. We're going to push off the back foot, lifting your front foot, ending with approximately the same starting stance. The retreat step will be similar, but in a backward direction, where you push off that front foot, lifting your back foot, and taking that step back. Advanced steps and retreat steps can be done in a gradient of length. This includes small advance and retreat steps, medium-sized steps, large-sized steps, and jumping steps in either direction, like a jumping advanced step, or what I would describe as a jump lunge. And a jumping retreat step is something similar, just in the other direction. And there's a variant where you move your front foot first. It's what John often calls a replacement step.
It's like a skip. You're literally just skipping backwards. And it actually gets your whole body out of range really fast too. But especially if someone's attacking my leg, boom, I'm right back in my stance. Could lunge back again, or retreat again. You can do a couple of them.
Bruh.
If you want to see John's full video, I'll put a link in the description down below. Now, here are some examples of linear advance steps and retreat steps done almost simultaneously to keep distance, range, measure, and essentially the distance between myself and the opponent. So here you'll notice we are both squared off at each other, and as he steps toward me, I am stepping back trying to keep that measure so that he does not get to the launching distance that he wants in order to throw. He's keeping measure through advanced steps and retreat steps, looking to probe, looking to defend. He explodes, and neither of us really do anything particularly intentional. It looks like I may have caught him on the foot. But you'll see all of our steps are small and varied. In contrast, you can see that we are still taking linear steps, but the starting stance is a little bit less long. I'm a little bit wider, a little less long in my armored stance. This is me fighting their Majesty Outlands, Hawkrill. I know that their Madu has range, has the longest range, so I need to either stay outside or get inside of that range in order to hit with my sword. Still using advanced and retreat linear steps as the primary But you'll notice once we are into that close range, that narrow measure, however you want to describe it, into A range, Kora, now more lateral steps happen in order to create angles to hit the individual around their defenses. Next, we'll look at lateral steps. Pushing off of our left foot while lifting our right foot to traverse to the right, and pushing off of the right foot and lifting left foot to travel to the left. Similar to linear steps, you can use these in a gradient from small to medium to large, and ultimately jumping lateral steps in either direction. Thrusting weapons such as rapier and dagger and spear tend to use more linear movement, forward and back, as opposed to lateral movement. In comparison, the footwork for something such as sword and board is a lot more akin to boxing, in which case you will have a lot more lateral movement, especially as you get closer and closer to the other person. The linear and lateral steps will often be used in conjunction and functionally tied together. Here's a side-by-side comparison. If you look at the feet here, I'm moving in a linear fashion with a little bit of lateral movement. And here you can see the sequence is mostly lateral movement with some linear motion. Let's now examine pivot steps. You can pivot off of either your front foot or your back foot, though it's typically more common to pivot off of your front foot, but either can and will situationally be used with other steps to either square up with your opponent or to gain an angle or an advantage on that opponent. Here's an example of squaring up to my opponent. And here is an example of using a compass step in conjunction with some other steps to gain that angle advantage we were talking about. Next, let's look at passing steps or cross steps. These can be done forward or backward and can be used to effectively gain or give ground. Similar to your linear and lateral steps, you can dynamically vary the step size and do so depending on the context in which you need. Here's an example of Nova using his passing step into a lunge and thrust, where you can hide the amount of ground you can cover. In contrast, here's an example of Duke Branos using wide passing steps to keep his opponent uncertain of which step might be the one used to commit an attack. Lastly, we have a lunge step. This is simply winding or lengthening your gait with the same push as a linear or lateral step, leaving the back foot planted. I believe I can fly. So, the lunge is integral to historical fencing, and I just wanted to add a few examples of lunge variants from historical texts. Big thank you to Justin Aquin over at the Boston Academy for letting me use some of the footage from his video. You can check out the full video in the description down below. Now that we've established individual pieces of footwork, let's look at some real-world examples of how these steps tie together in a functional fighting context. This is John and I in the finals of the Lord Baltimore's Challenge, a HEMA SCA crossover event run by Master Aaron Harper. This was a few years back. You can see we're still using linear, advanced, and retreat steps to maintain measure, but it's also combined with more lateral and pivot steps given the context of the smaller ring. Here we can see a similar situation on the armored side where our list is only a few steps in any direction. This is footage from Fall Crown, and Sir Laren and I are making the fight mostly about thrust attacks toward one another. Because of this, there is a bit of lateral movement, but it's primarily advance and retreat steps to maintain measure, looking for a window of opportunity to face thrust one another. Those last two demonstrations of real-world application should hopefully guide the programming for your training. I usually have my students build foundational knowledge and then add steps on said foundation. For example, let's say someone lunges and thrusts at you. One piece of footwork to deal with that is to take a linear retreat step to give yourself distance and thus time to process their action and react appropriately. Let's say we paired that step back with a successful outside pairing. I now have the opportunity to riposte with a lunge. However, I have knowledge that this opponent is fleet-footed and has a rapid retreat step. I may now make the choice to take an extra advanced step before lunging for the kill. When I am solo drilling these pieces of footwork, I try to envision the context in which I would use various pieces of said footwork. It is in that context which will program the combination of footwork I end up drilling. While I tend to program my own footwork drills for specific situations, if you want a more general athletic set of drills, I would highly recommend checking out these latter drills. This is footage filmed from Coach's Corner this past Penzik number 51. And if you want to see the full video, I'll make sure to put a link in the description down below.
Please like and subscribe.
Now, for this last section of this video, I just want to go over my top 5 footwork principles. Number 1, keep some stored potential energy. We do this by lowering our level and keeping an appropriate amount of knee bend. The more the bend, the more potential energy you have stored, but you have to balance that with how much muscular endurance you have for staying at that level. This ties into number 2. Stay level to minimize telegraphing intent. Don't be like a cat and lower your hips before you pounce forward. Staying level will mask your intention, which minimizes the amount of time your opponent has to react. Number 3. Pay attention to the distribution of weight. This is equal linear and lateral distribution of my body weight, but here I'm now obviously front foot weighted, and here I'm back weighted, and now I'm leaning to my left and thus putting extra weight on my left foot. For yourself, if your weight is centered, you will have equal opportunity to move in any direction. But if you're heavy in a particular direction, it limits the options that you have to move your feet. Number 4, your forward movement is based on the back foot placement. Be aware that folks trying to sneak their back foot up means that they have a want to move further forward toward you. If you have a shorter starting stance, that also allows for more potential forward movement. Lastly, number 5. In all actions, try to be dynamic. This applies to footwork as well as all other aspects of actions that you take during a fight. If any action is predictable, then it can be exploited. So to summarize, training footwork is such a good investment of your time, as the training translates into a wide variety of activity. When I began crossing over from rapier to armored combat, the baseline ability to move and understand how my footwork impacted everything above it was such a boost that excelled my armored journey. Even though it wasn't 100% applicable, I'd certainly assert that the majority of footwork did cross over and mostly had to make smaller adjustments for the different context. Please let me know in the comments down below if you have any questions about footwork or have an idea of a combat concept which I should dive into next. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you all on the next one. Goodbye. See you next time. Goodbye. See you in the next video.